Over the past 24 hours, the Russians have continued significant advances all throughout the southern parts and western parts of the Donetsk region into the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia regions. The Russians made a new entry into the Dnipropetrovsk region from the west of Pokrovsk, additional advances in the direction of Novka from the south, additional advances in the Dnipropetrovsk region along the northern flank of the second line of defense, and within the Zaporizhia region along the first line of defense in the direction of Hulyaipole, where offensive operations continues towards the city and logistical hub. Additional advances west of Pokrovsk along the railway line, and advances to the southeast of Pokrovsk, gaining full control over Lysivka, as well as a re-entry into Satyshok north of Menderat, and additional offensive operations towards Shahove and the northeast of Rodensk. Starting out to the southwest, the Russians have managed to gain control over the eastern flank of Rivnopilya, as well as the southern flank of Slutke, combining their forces in the Slutke direction down towards Rivnopilya, and from the road itself towards Rivnopilya as in the southeast. The Russians are here entering both into Yablukove and Rivnopilya, gaining control over the first line just on the eastern outskirts of Rivnopilya and infiltrating into the residential buildings. In combination with these assaults, the Russians are launching heavy artillery strikes on Yablukove and Rivnopilya, forcing the Ukrainians to withdraw from these settlements whoever survives these assault and artillery strikes. The capture of Rivnopilya and Yablukove is significant for the Russian offensive operations in the direction of Hulyaipole, as it significantly improves the Russian positions along the first line of defense, all the way down towards Satyshia, giving the Russians the advantage, and the Ukrainians would be forced to withdraw either down south towards the fortifications or in the western direction towards the highway in the northwest, both of which the Ukrainians will be forced away from the front line, opening up the road for the Russians to continue the flanking maneuvers in the rear of the defensive line. The Ukrainians are also launching counterattack operations throughout the front line, limiting the reserves they have available to respond to this situation, which explains why they haven't sent reinforcements despite many weeks of the Russian advances speeding up in this section of the front line and the now local collapse of the Ukrainian positions in the area. To the north of this, the Russians managed to gain a solid foothold within Oristoil and gain control over much of the road to the west, where the Russians connect their forces here along the small town along the Vovcha River line up towards Oristoil, with additional supply lines connecting their forces in both sides. This means the Russians have control over the road leading directly towards Oristoil, the forest line leading up towards the road, additional forest lines in the area, and the forest line connecting Oleksivka to the small town along the Vovcha River line, all of which can be redirected towards Oristoil and establishing a defensive line in the western direction. A capture of Oristoil and the forest lines being under their control allowed the Russians to start fighting in the direction of Veliko Mikhailivka, as well as the rear of Sosnivka and fortifications along the Vovcha River line, to regain full control over the river line and counterattack the Ukrainian bridgeheads across near Oleksandrorad and Sosnivka. To the northeast of this, the Russians continued offensive operations in the direction of Novopavlivka, where they managed to gain full control over the road leading up towards the eastern flank of Novopavlivka, and flanking the fortifications, the hourglass fortifications to the southeast of Novopavlivka. This connects the forces with the ones operating within Novopavlivka with a road leading directly to the hourglass formation from the south. That means a push by the Russians from the east, south, and northwest is possible towards this hourglass formation, putting as much pressure as possible on it. What we see from this hourglass formation is that it is in two parts. There is the trench system in the formation of an hourglass, where the Ukrainian forces can move between the different flanks and defend from every single direction. Then there is the firing positions of vehicles that are located within the hourglass formation, where Ukrainian armored vehicles can act from. However, these positions are all vulnerable to drones. This means that the Russians can attack this hourglass formation with drone strikes that can destroy the vehicles, as well as the infantry operating within the trench system. Without concrete fortifications, all of these trench systems will be vulnerable to drones. The Russians are likely targeting the area with artillery and drones around the clock, and targeting the supply line with direct fire from the southern parts of Novopavlivka, which will cut off the supplies going to these fortifications, and the drones operating along the other roads as well. grinding down the Ukrainian forces within the hourglass formation and attacking the supplies going to it, which will weaken it over time, allowing the Russians to then strike it and storm it with a few infantry to take control of it, wipe out what remains of Ukrainian forces, and have control over the road leading up towards Novka. To the northeast of this, the Russians made a new entry into the Dnipropetrovsk region here to the west of Pokrovsk, where the Russians have managed to gain a foothold within the town of Novopetrovsk. The Russians advanced along the railway line from Molodetsk up towards the town from the south, gaining control over the fortifications and breaching the anti-tank ditches and dragon-teeth lines between the Dnipropetrovsk and Donetsk regions. With the foothold gained, the Russians have started clearing the buildings one after another to push through the settlement, and most of the settlements here along the 246 highway and the railway line have a lot of buildings on them and have larger populations because of the close proximity to the railways. The Ukrainians are able to naturally live in these areas much better than areas far from railway lines. The infrastructure means more dense populations. So most of the settlements will be along the railway line all throughout the Dnipropetrovsk region, where the farther away from the roads and highways you are, the fewer and more sparse the settlements become. This generally means that the Russian offensive operations going further into the Dnipropetrovsk regions and the regions beyond the Donetsk region will be mainly centered around the highways and railways, while within the Donetsk region, the density is so large that they can advance anywhere, regardless of the positions closer or further from railways and highways, which also means that both sides will be concentrating their forces in smaller areas rather than larger areas, which is beneficial to artillery, MLRS, and airstrikes, and not so beneficial to drones, because simply said, the more drones there are in the sky, the easier it is to shoot them down, while artillery have area of effect damage, the same with MLRS, the same with airstrikes. The more concentrated forces are, the more they will be struck by these artillery, MLRS, and airstrikes. In conclusion, airstrikes, MLRS, and artillery strikes are more effective the more concentrated forces are. Drones are less effective because of the lower payloads, and the more you have of them, the easier it is to strike them down, which would limit your casualties in larger concentrations. The strength of drones is in smaller concentrations and longer travel distances because they can attack in real time, while artillery, MLRs, and airstrikes are more useful against stationary targets. To the west of Pokrovsk, the Russians managed to gain control over additional defensive fortifications and forest lines west of the city, as they are looking to gain control over the area in between the northern and southern railway into the Dnipropetrovsk region, following the capture of the coal mine, and now advances north of Kotline. The Russians are developing offensive operations towards Serhivka and Trishene from the southern direction. To the east of Pokrovsk, the Russians managed to gain full control over Lysivka and push into Sukhiyar from the western direction, and they're storming the fortifications of the Ukrainians here to the south of Minorat, looking to gain control over the fortifications that the Ukrainians have yet to withdraw from here south of Minorat. To the north of this, the Russians launched a counterattack towards Setishuk, following artillery preparations on the Ukrainian positions, regaining control over the fortifications and much of Setishuk from the southern and eastern directions. This push by the Russians is aimed at regaining control over the northern flank of Rodinsk, following the Ukrainian intensified attacks towards the city, and to prevent the Ukrainians from gaining control over the Boykivka area. So the objective is to regain control over Sokhetsk and Setishuk, secure the supply lines into Rodinsk, and push the Ukrainians out of the city, and then connect their forces between Rodinsk and Pokrovsk to the south, with the encirclement over Minorat and the capture of the city. To the north of this, the Russians launched offensive operations north and east of Shahove, gaining control over the fortifications located north of the town. With this, the Russians have completely cut off the western connection to Shahove, and at the eastern flank, the Russians are continuing offensive operations along the forest lines, where they're looking to gain full control over the eastern flank as well. The supply lines going in and out of Shahove are now fully under Russian control, where the Ukrainians cannot enter either from the northern, eastern, or western flanks. That means all of the positions of the Ukrainians within Volodymyrivka and Shahove are all completely cut off. The Ukrainians will now have to resupply only through drones and through nothing else, and reinforcements are not able to arrive at the front line either. This means the Russians are likely going to double down on their push to gain control over Shahove, which will then allow them to have a solid position here along the river line, which will allow them to launch offensive operations further north towards Sofievka at the rear of these fortifications, and to launch counterattacks in the direction of Novoshahove, Ivanivka, Droshkivka, and other settlements here on the western bank of the river line. Generally, the situation will be much better for the Russian forces operating here on the northern flank of Menderat than it currently is, and the Ukrainian counterattack will meet a significant step back, as the Russians would have much better supply lines to a smaller section of the front line than they had prior to the Ukrainian counterattack. This means the Russians would hold less territory, but they'll have a stronger hold over this territory, and therefore counterattacks such as the ones towards Setishok will increase, and the Russians will return to being on the offensive rather than defensive here on the northern flank of Menderat, despite the ongoing siege of Pokrovsk and Menderat. Especially with the recent influx of Russian forces into the city, as reported on in the previous update. The Russians now have a solid position within Pokrovsk and Menderat, which will allow them to quickly gain control over what remains under Ukrainian controls within these two cities, and develop offensive operations beyond it in the direction of Reshene, Rodinsk, and onwards towards Dnipropetrovsk and the Dnipropetrovsk region. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.